So you know that other video I made? And by that other video, I mean the only other video I have made on this channel? That one kind of took off, didn't it? But seriously, I cannot thank you guys enough for the incredible feedback and reception I got in the last video. I'm rather proud of how it turned out myself, so it was really cool to see that people actually liked it after the algorithm did its thing with it. I especially wanted to thank you all for how cool most of you were in the comments. Even when there were disagreements and critiques, they were mostly pretty constructive, and I appreciate that. I was low-key expecting some vitriol if that video were to ever take off, so it was a pleasant surprise to see just how cool people can be when you don't claim Link is dead, I guess. So this is a part 2. I will be addressing some points and counterpoints made in the comments of my last video, as well as touching on things Tears of the Kingdom added to the discussion. I will not, however, be recapping my last map theory video. If you have not seen it, this video will not make as much sense. So if you do intend to watch this, please make sure you've seen that video first. The link to the past video is in the description. And, as long as I'm discouraging people from watching this video, now would be a good time to say that this video contains spoilers for The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. If you have not seen the Dragon Tear memory cutscenes, and or want to discover this game's new items and landmarks for yourself, then I recommend you come back later. We good? Cool. So before I go into the critiques of my last video, I'm gonna briefly look at a few things from Tears of the Kingdom's map that I found interesting. First and foremost, the story of Tears of the Kingdom recontextualizes the whole Birthplace of Hyrule quote from Breath of the Wild in a way that removes its relation to Skyward Sword. Oops, my bad. I don't think it's that big of an issue though, due to how Breath of the Wild relates to Twilight Princess, how Twilight Princess relates to Ocarina of Time, and how Ocarina relates to Skyward Sword. But severing that one support definitely weakens the claims I made to transition to Skyward Sword. There is another point you guys brought up that challenges the relationship between Ocarina and Skyward Sword, but I'll get into that in a bit, okay? One new thing we get to see in Tears of the Kingdom is a contour map from the time of King Rauru's founding of Hyrule in this room behind the Forgotten Temple. I know we need to talk about the temple as a whole, but give me a minute, I'll get there, okay? We know this is an earlier map because the Dueling Peaks, which legend says was split in two by a dragon, is shown to be intact here. It also, interestingly, shows that Death Mountain was about in the same place in Rauru's time as it is in modern Hyrule, although this does have different implications depending on where in the timeline you believe the Dragon Tear cutscenes take place. One other thing this shows is that the Great Plateau, complete with Mount Hylia shown in the terrain, and the island where the Lost Woods is found, note the flat, mountainless terrain, also line up with where we see them in modern times. So, to the people who watched someone else's theory video about how the two areas apparently may have magically swapped at some point in the past, and then decided they needed to cite it in the comments of my last video as though it was a canon detail I overlooked, this shows that if they ever did swap, it had to have been before the time of King Rauru, which would mean different things depending on where you believe that takes place in the timeline. Or maybe it's just a thing that never actually happened, and it was all just a really cool, fun theory video that you should probably go watch because it was a cool video made by cool people that I respect. Tears of the Kingdom also introduces the area known as the Depths, which I'm not quite sure what to make of. We don't really get any clues as to how, why, or when they formed and what implications that could have for the rest of the series. And theorizing their nature and origins is a bit outside the scope of today's video. We could look at a few individual dungeons or areas from past games and ask if they might possibly dip into the depths, but given how expansive and, frankly, generic the depths are, I don't think that would add much to this discussion. But there are two things that I found in the depths that I do think are worth taking note of and talking about here. Underneath Death Mountain, we find a huge area of high heat with a large amount of magma. Due to its nature as a recently active volcano, that's kind of to be expected. But what I found more interesting is that this isn't the only place that shows signs of underground volcanic activity, as a few points under the Hebra mountain range, as well as this one kind of random spot under Bremen Peak, also have their own lava falls. Interestingly, I found no other such evidence of either potential or historic volcanic activity anywhere else. None of the other mountain ranges, the Great Plateau, or any of the islands seem to have been formed by volcanic activity. Either that or they've just been dormant for so very, 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 very long that no traces of their volcanic origins can still be found even a mile under the ground. So, to the people who proposed that perhaps the volcanic death mountains from previous games could have been completely different from the ones we see in Breath of the Wild, between this and the Forgotten Temple map, I find that unlikely. Now, the mountain could definitely have changed size, shape, and even which and how many peaks had craters, because changes like that do happen when lava cools into rock and new eruptions happen, but I don't think that the death mountains that we see in other games could have strayed too far from the systems of volcanic activity that we see under Tears of the Kingdom's Hyrule. The other points of interest that I wanted to address in the depths are the Wellsprings of Power, Courage, and Wisdom, as well as the Secret Spring of Renewal, which lie directly underneath the Springs of Power, Courage, and Wisdom, and the Shrine of Resurrection, respectively. This is significant to me because it shows that these springs that share similar architecture to the Skyview and Earth Springs from Skyward Sword are tied to sources of blessed water that lie deep under the earth. Although the Springs of Power and Courage did line up pretty nicely with where I placed the Earth and Skyview Springs in my last video, I was hesitant to call that out due to both the length of the video, but also because I was unsure of how permanent and immovable those springs were. But since it seems that these goddess springs may have a link to these ancient underground well springs, it seems more likely to me now that they would be located in the same place. Meaning my previous placement of Skyward Sword's map now has more evidence for it. Except it also has one big point against it. And here comes the part that I've alluded to twice already, because those aren't the only direct architectural references to Skyward Sword in the Wild Era games. Far and away, the single most prominent criticism that last video received was in regards to my placement of the Sealed Temple, because there's evidence to support the popular theory that the Forgotten Temple of Breath of the Wild is the actual location of the Sealed Temple. The architecture is darn near one-to-one, the Mother Goddess statue is stated to be the largest and oldest in Hyrule, there's a tree in the same alcove where Link plants the Tree of Life in Skyward Sword, and the reward you get for doing the Goddess statue quest in Tears of the Kingdom is the Goddess Sword. Although, I am choosing to read that last point as more of a cool reference rather than indicating anything canon, because if you're going to take that one throwback reference weapon that seriously, you should probably also give similar weight to the rest of the throwback reference weapons and costumes, which is just kind of impossible to reconcile. Unless you care to explain why the Zonai Labyrinths have Ocarina of Time's Phantom Ganon armor for some reason, or why the Majora's Mask is in the depths being guarded by a bunch of Lynels. Or how the Link's Awakening hat makes any sense at all. I do agree that the White Sword of the Sky says something about how the developers intend you to interpret this building, but I cannot bring myself to believe it is literally the same sword from Skyward Sword. There's a whole lot of cool references to past games in Breath of the Wild, which is why I initially brushed this off in my video. It's really hard to parse out what's canon and what's a cute throwaway reference in these games. Like sure, the ranch ruins in Breath of the Wild have the exact same layout as Lon Lon Ranch from Ocarina of Time, but you don't expect me to believe that a wooden farmhouse has survived 10,000 plus years of wars and weathering, do you? Do you? We have zero remains of the Great Bridges from Twilight Princess, no sign of any of the massive sacred underground temples from any of the previous games, but you expect me to believe that this one simple, man-made wooden structure has stood intact for longer than real-life human history has been recorded? It's a cute reference, and nothing more, which is why I was also skeptical about the Forgotten Temple. And nothing in Skyward Sword seems to suggest that the area around the Sealed Temple is, or could become a canyon, or buried under the ground for any reason except for maybe a sudden unexpected earthquake, which is unlikely because the Forgotten Temple's in surprisingly good condition for an earthquake victim. Also, there's that tree that sits roughly in the place of the Tree of Life that bears the progression critical healing fruit, and it's noticeably barren. That would have been the perfect opportunity to have a consistent source of golden apples, or give us a fruit that heals the effects of gloom, or something hardy that heals you beyond full, or something, really anything that hammers home that Tree of Life reference. It's a little thing that can be explained away because trees can stop giving fruit after they get old enough, but that also means there's no proof that this has to be the exact same tree, you know? It might be, but there's no reason it has to be. It could be any tree. But if we do take this placement super seriously and move the sealed temple all the way up to where the Forgotten Temple is, it quite frankly bends the map past the breaking point. And that's saying something, because I was pretty okay with a lot of map mutilation in the other video. But it's one thing to take the points and stretch them further apart. It's another thing to take those points and rearrange them. This is just a bigger version of the same triangle, but this is a completely different triangle. Plus, I just got done cementing the placements of the Skyview and Earth Springs, and this placement moves the Theron region a long way from any of the existing springs. But lining up the springs moves the sealed temple a long way from Tanagar Canyon. Although now might be a good time to clarify that Skyview Spring in the Theron Forest of Skyward Sword has architecture that's identical to the Spring of Power from Breath of the Wild located at the foot of Death Mountain. And the Earth Spring from Skyward Sword, located in Elden Volcano, is identical to the Spring of Wisdom on top of the icy Mount Lanayru that has no volcanic activity in the depths below it whatsoever, because that only makes sense, right? Did you know these three games have the same director, producer, and share a lot of the same dev team? So naturally, when referencing the immediately previous game in the series that they just finished working on, they totally screw up the easy and obvious references because nobody actually cares. It's like no thought whatsoever gets put into the placements of these sorts of cute visual references. They might even be doing this on purpose just to mess with us. Kind of like how Tears of the Kingdom's story is intentionally vague and flippantly defies the fans to figure out the timeline placement themselves because Nintendo doesn't want to. This is precisely why I didn't consider uncanny referential architecture as a solid anchor point in my last video. Anyway, rant aside, let's go back to assuming that the Volcano Spring lines up with the Volcano Spring, and that the Wood Spring to the south lines up with the Wood Spring to the south, because the alternative gets really stupid really fast. We could employ my loading zones rule and separate the sealed temple from the rest of the Theron region and push it all the way over there, but now the map's even more broken. It's one thing to take the points in a shape and stretch them into a larger shape. It's another thing to take those points and rearrange them beyond all recognition. This is a bigger triangle, this is a different triangle, and this is not a triangle anymore. And if I was willing to rearrange the relationship between areas that much, I wouldn't have even made the last video. I'd have just claimed that every castle's the same castle, every Kakariko's the same town, and every Lake Hylia is the same lake. They're all just allowed to completely change their locational relationship with one another because of vague, hand-wavy, unsatisfying explanations like magic or they're just legends, which is the exact kind of map analysis that I was dissatisfied with enough to want to make my own video in the first place. Plus, we know from various points in Skyward Sword that the sealed temple has to be pretty near the Theron Woods. A lot of story bits would no longer make any sense if they were miles upon miles upon miles apart. So, what's the solution? Well, let's look at everything we're presented with. There is a goddess statue in Breath of the Wild's Forgotten Temple, but no Master Sword pedestal. There is a Master Sword pedestal in Ocarina's Temple of Time, but no goddess statue. The goddess statue in the sealed temple is referred to as the Mother Goddess statue and is stated to be the oldest and largest in Hyrule. The sealed temple used to be the Temple of Hylia and was originally constructed to honor her. In creating a champion, the Forgotten Temple is stated to have been originally built to honor the past heroes of Hyrule. Both the Hyrule Historia and Zelda Encyclopedia state that the sage Rauru built the Temple of Time over the ruins of the sealed temple to seal the Triforce in the Sacred Realm. I know that both the Historia and Encyclopedia can get a bad rap and have their issues, but it's interesting that they're consistent on this, seeing as how the Encyclopedia was released a few days before Breath of the Wild and was in development alongside it. If it was their intention to change that part of the previously accepted canon, they would have had the perfect opportunity to pass a few notes to the team consulting and collaborating with the publishers. Just saying. The way I see it, the best explanation that allows all of the above to remain true and manages to preserve any integrity that the map in Skyward Sword may have had is as follows. At some point between Skyward Sword and Ocarina of Time, the remains of the sealed temple were moved, whether magically all at once or manually brick by brick, along with the Mother Goddess statue to construct a new temple meant to honor the memory and record of Hyrule's heroes. But also, in the process, they left the Master Sword behind because there's only one guy who can pull that out to move it. If you happen to be in the camp that believes the Dragon Tear cutscenes happen after Skyward Sword but before Ocarina of Time, then perhaps it was King Rauru and Queen Sonia that moved the sealed temple. Or maybe it was Minoru and her Zonai constructs that moved it. And then they could have been the ones that also added the ancient floor map with the locations of the Dragon Tears. Then, at some point afterwards, the Sage Rauru built Ocarina's Temple of Time using the foundations of the sealed temple, and then he used the sword that can only be drawn by a worthy hero as a lock for his seal on the Triforce. This is an explanation that allows all the conflicting in-game statements, in-game visuals, and Word of God statements from officially licensed sources to remain true. Or maybe that's just my confirmation bias getting in the way. I really don't like presuming the existence of big, landmark-moving events that are never mentioned in canon unless there's a good reason to. That's the whole reason I was reluctant to say things like the Master Sword, or Force Sword, or Triforce could just move willy-nilly between games that are right next to each other on the timeline, when the games themselves give absolutely zero reason to believe that they would have. But this has enough conflicting information to warrant this kind of explanation, if you ask me. And relocating, or just building a replica of one building, is an easier pill for me to swallow than, hey, you know that sword that only one person is capable of removing from its pedestal that's acting as a key sealing away a sacred treasure and or calamitous demon? Let's just move that for no apparent reason. Yeah, other people have been able to hold, move, and place the sword, but only one person has ever been shown to be able to remove it once it's been set, and that's the chosen hero. On a related note to the Springs and Hidden Temple, there's also Lanayru Promenade that has a similar Skyloftian architecture, which I find it interesting that this ancient thoroughfare is located a little south of that Lesser Hyrule region. It's almost as if this place was settled by Skyloft-era Hylians early in the timeline or something. Just a point I thought was interesting as long as we're taking this architecture thing super seriously. Another thing that bears mentioning in Tears of the Kingdom is the Sky Islands. And I have no idea how or if they relate to other Skylofts, cities in the sky, or realms of the heavens from other games. I'm not even sure how they relate to the surface of Tears of the Kingdom's map. While meaningful terrestrial-based continental drift happens on a scale of millions of years, thus why I never mentioned it in the previous video, which only covers time skips of a couple thousand years, I have no clue how fast or how far floating islands in the sky drift away from their original place. According to Skyward Sword, that drift is slow enough that the goddess statue can land perfectly in the place it was cut from 1,000 or so years ago, but in Tears of the Kingdom it's fast enough that none of the terrain around the Zonai Temple of Time from the Dragon Tear memories matches the terrain surrounding the place directly below the Great Sky Island in Tears of the Kingdom. Although come to think of it, if you look at the Great Sky Island, it's just about the same size and shape as the Great Plateau. Just rotate it 90 degrees and translate it to the southwest, and then the frozen mountains line up approximately, and the Zonai Temple of Time would lay about where the Eastern Abbey was built. The geography around it still isn't a perfect match, but it's way better than the area it floats above in the present. Plus, the Great Sky Island is made up of several smaller islands that have drifted to overlap one another, so maybe straightening out those missing pieces would fix those discrepancies. And this other cutscene that shows the Zonai Temple of Time from the desert pretty much seals it. This is the plateau. This would make the old man's Birthplace of Hyrule statement make sense with the context Tears of the Kingdom adds. Also, building on what was said before about moving the sealed temple, maybe the reason it was moved was for the construction of King Raru's Temple of Time. And then when that was lifted into the sky, that's where the sage Rauru built his Temple of Time. Although that proposition does assume a certain timeline placement, and there still isn't a general consensus about that yet. I was initially going to have a portion of this video dedicated to discussing where I believe the memories take place in the timeline, but that just distracted from the main point and would set off a whole different line of discussion outside the scope of this video. But I will say, if you're in the refounding post-timeline camp, or in the Skyward Sword split timeline camps, then Tears of the Kingdom doesn't affect my last video at all, aside from the old man's Birthplace of Hyrule statement. Like, sure, I may be comparing maps across timelines, but they have the same starting point, and the geography wouldn't change aside from a few forests, towns, and lakes and rivers, which I've already accounted for. The one set of timeline placements that would require some explanation is if you believe the tier cutscenes happen before Skyward Sword or post-Skyward pre-Ocarina, which is why that's the placement I've been singling out. I'm not 100% convinced that's where it happened myself, but I don't want to alienate the viewers who do subscribe to that placement by not addressing some of the problems it would present to my theory. Speaking of which, there's one final element Tears of the Kingdom introduces that changes the context if it happens in that part of the timeline, and that's the placement of Ganondorf and the castle. If this is a refounding or a branch timeline to Ocarina of Time, then it doesn't matter at all. But if this is pre-Ocarina, that means we have a Ganon corpse sealed under a castle that doesn't move for the entirety of the timeline between Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild. But why does this mean we suddenly have to assume they're all the same castle now? Couldn't this castle just be chilling in the background while different ones in active use? In fact, some of the other castles seem to have been built over or near spots where other demon kings and magical relics of power have been sealed away. And I don't claim to be an expert on magical seals, but I'm inclined to think that demon kings are the kind of reactive hazardous material that you don't want to store right next to each other. Besides that, rewatching all of Tears of the Kingdom's cutscenes, there's no exterior shots of the castle to even establish what castle placement this is. There's no way to tell if the castle that Rauru and Sonia actively used was the same one in the same place as modern times. In fact, all the other outdoor shots with them seem to take place on the Great Plateau. Furthermore, nothing about the memories seems to indicate that Ganon was specifically sealed under the castle at all. If the castle ever was intended to be a seal, that could just as easily have been a much later addition to plug the calamity leaks that kept coming out of the random cave Ganon was sealed in. The floor map behind the Forgotten Temple does feature the castle in its modern placement, but the chamber seems to have been built after and because the dragon tears were shed. Even the ancient mural under Hyrule Castle features the Light Dragon's transformation on it, meaning this castle was probably built after the tier cutscenes took place anyway. And as long as we've decided we need to take architecture seriously for the sealed temple, why don't we be consistent in the rules we establish and compare the architecture of the castle in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom to what we see in Ocarina of Time, or Link to the Past, or the Minish Cap, or Twilight Princess? Oh hey! That one actually looks pretty close. And that's also the only one I matched with the Greater Hyrule placement in my other video! If this castle is supposed to be some kind of seal, and it's supposed to be the same castle throughout all of history, that doesn't sound like the kind of thing you can just remodel from the ground up every few hundred years. And also, if Tears of the Kingdom Ganondorf did his thing pre-Ocarina of Time, and it's all supposed to be under that one castle, then why wasn't his corpse uncovered in the two timelines where Ocarina Dwarf tore a big red glowing gaping hole open under the castle of his time? Perhaps because Tears Dwarf wasn't under that castle. Or he wasn't under any castle yet, and that's just not the timeline placement. That's still a possibility. So I guess my answer to all the potential problems Tears of the Kingdom introduces is maybe they just aren't actually problems if you think about it. The second big counterpoint we need to talk about is Four Sword Adventures, as it was brought to my attention that the Four Sword Sanctuary is somehow not beneath the castle. Yes, there's a magical portal sealed by the magic of 7 sages that leads to the Four Sword Sanctuary under the castle, but somehow there's also just an entrance in the woods past the Ice Temple. How did I miss this? Like, seriously, how did I miss this? I got this game for my birthday when I was like 9. I played the crap out of this game. How do I just forget this? Then again, why was there a magically sealed portal under the castle in the first place? Why put that door there and seal it if there's just another door that's only blocked by a temple? What the actual heck? This game is dumb. I can't trust the scaling on this map, but the Ice Temple isn't that far from the castle. Maybe the path in the woods leads to an alternate entrance to the same place under the castle? Or maybe the Ice Palace was built in the lesser Hyrule Castle placement and the Four Sword Adventure Castle is just a different location. It might even be the greater Hyrule Castle due to the timeline placement, the architecture, and the rest of the map was just horrendously scaled. I don't know. This map is dumb and I'm done trying to make excuses for it. I also got quite a few comments about how much discourse there actually is surrounding the timeline placement of the Four Sword games. How a lot of people are really dissatisfied with their places in the timeline and would like a total timeline rework or even just to strike them from the canon altogether. These things are things I was aware of, but I didn't want to go into in the last video because I didn't really have the time or scope to challenge any of the currently standing Word of God statements on the timeline. I wasn't really interested in using alternate theories to support what could already have been a contentious video. One final thing, a general comment I got was regarding the fact that I didn't change the orientation of the maps much, even though north being up isn't necessarily a given thing. That is something I had considered, but for the most part, I didn't end up needing to do it. Believe me, if I really needed to do so in order to make something work, I would have. But everything ended up fitting pretty well, give or take a few degrees. The only remaining maps that could have used it were probably Skyward Sword and Minish Cap, but even then, they only really needed to be turned about 45 degrees to fit into their placements better, so I didn't bother. So, I think that's it. That's all I really have to add to my map theory at this time. I want to once again thank you all for the attention and support the other video got. That was pretty darn cool if you ask me. And if you want to continue supporting, I assume you already know the anatomy of YouTube, so I don't need to remind you of how this works. I can't guarantee too many more Zelda theory videos in the future. I might talk about my thoughts on Tears of the Kingdom's timeline placement at some point, and I have another, less consequential, more just kind of fun and silly one I want to do about Triforce Heroes. But not all the other things I eventually want to make videos about are Zelda or theory related. Just figured I'd give you a heads up in case you decide to subscribe, judging my future content based entirely on one video that I uploaded. Can't thank you enough for that, by the way. With that, I'll talk to you in the comments or the next stream I do or a future video. Okay, love you, bye.